Hello, everybody. This is Mr. S.
And Mr. McGregor. Today we're going to talk about inbreeding and selective breeding. Now, the term breeding probably makes you think of dogs. At least it makes me think of dogs. When we talk about dog breeds, we're talking about a specific desired breed. That's why people get purebred dogs. But breeding actually applies to all species. You can have breeds of cats. You can have breeds of human and horses. So breeding simply refers to the act of procreating or making offspring. We'll start with selective breeding. So selective breeding, selective meaning something that you choose, you select, something that's desirable. Selective breeding is when organisms with desired traits are selected to reproduce and create offspring with those desired traits. So you see this a lot of times with farm animals. A specific example I like to think about are racehorses. So racehorses have very specific desirable traits, A, because it's a big financial industry, but B, there are certain physical characteristics that a racehorse needs to have in order to be competitive. And so they can actually trace the genetic lineage of a racehorse all the way back to one specific racehorse that all of today's racehorses can be traced back to. So in this case, we have a couple of examples on this slide. You have the domesticated pig right here, and here is the feral, the wild pig. And so this is an example of what can happen through the process of selective breeding. Here is a wild goat, and here is the goat you would see if you visited a farm today that had goats. We see this a lot with dogs too. Dalmatians. When you have a Dalmatian, is it desirable to have a Dalmatian with like one or two spots, or do you want that kind of classic firefighter companion dog with tons of black spots on it? Teacup poodles. Are they that size naturally? No, they had to be bred in order to get that miniature size. And that would require taking two tiny chihuahuas or poodles or whatever it is in the first place, or maybe breeding a chihuahua and a poodle together to kind of get that small desired effect, and slowly over time making a smaller and smaller and smaller version of that dog.
Another case of selective breeding would be the sheep of today. Now, these are kind of just examples of wild species of sheep, and these are probably males, and the one over here is a female. Has to do with the horns and that type of thing. But the big thing to point out is this one looks a little more ridiculous with this giant poof of fur. Now, that was selectively bred for. And the way they did this is, back in the day, is they would just take one sheep, and if it had a big, woolly coat on, you'd breed that with another sheep that had a big woolly coat, and hopefully you would slowly get sheep being born with bigger and bigger coats. Now, the reason for this is because you would then shear it, or like kind of give it a buzz cut, and use that wool to make clothing. And they've actually documented the amount of wool on sheep's growing through the centuries. And there are books that were kept about how much wool was on the sheep at the time. Very interesting book to read, I bet. And the sheeps that were in medieval periods, so the 5th period to the 15th century, were documented to have about a pound and a half of wool on their body. When you shave them, you'd get a pound and a half. Whereas the sheep in the 18th century, after many, many breeds, you'd actually get sheep that had up to 9 pounds of wool coming off these things. So over time, there's been an exponential growth or an upward growth of the amount of wool on the sheep as people got better and better, and woolier and woolier sheep were being born. And today, with actually using some processes of genetic selection, we've actually been able to amplify the amount of wool to such a degree that the sheep could not even survive without us. It has so much wool. And there's that bad boy right there. You can see, can't even see, that's not a adulterated picture. And yep, so that's the amount of wool that are on the sheep today. Okay, so yes, sheep clearly were not running around the forests before medieval time looking like this. No way it could survive. But now, with selective breeding, we've actually made the sheep become ultra woolly.
When we talk about domestication and artificial selection, the term artificial is really important here. Because that means that it's happening not naturally. So, for instance, corn, as we know it today, was derived from the breeding of certain types of grasses and wheat to create a more nutrient-rich, flavorful offspring, which we now know as corn, but this happens systematically over time. Just as now, when we are talking about like tomatoes, now this is the growth span of a tomato, but realistically this is probably what it looked like over the course of its development and domestication. Now when you go to the grocery store to get a tomato, you have these gigantic, very sweet, flavorful tomatoes, but they didn't just get that way automatically. It happened over time by initially taking two tomato plants that were robust or had a lot of tomatoes that were sweeter and breeding them together in hopes of getting another one of those tomato plants or an even better one. But today, with genetic modification, what they can do is isolate the genes that are specifically related to sweetness or to size and duplicate those to make sure that the offspring of those two plants that are being duplicated are better and bigger than the previous generation. And that's what they're talking about when they say GMOs or genetically modified foods. So a lot of times when you're at the grocery store, especially if you're in a more organic grocery store like Whole Foods or something like that, you'll see stickers that say non-GMO. Because the growing segment of our population is looking for foods that are not modified in that way. Inbreeding, on the other hand, is the continued breeding of individuals with similar characteristics. So the term in is operative here. That means it's happening within a breeding community. So related individuals mating. And this is sort of a repulsive aspect of not too distant human history where royalty was actually inherited. And so royal families would breed ancestrally to protect their family's royal legacy. And we're going to go into this in more detail, but to give you a quick example, in these portraits you can see the dramatic underbite, which was actually a recessive genetic trait made more pronounced through inbreeding. You also see this in dog breeds. And when people want to get like a purebred husky, they're going to go specifically and pay top dollar to find a purebred husky. And people who are breeding them are looking for dogs that match a very specific set of characteristics and breeding them together. So because this is such a lucrative business, meaning that it makes a lot of money, the cheapest way for unethical dog breeders to do this is to find a parent that has all of the desired characteristics of that breed. And when it produces offspring, they breed the offspring that that parent initially had with the parent again. And that kind of helps to maintain those desirable characteristics. So let's take a look at two dogs. Here is one. What a beauty. And here is the other. Yep. What's up, buddy? So, if I asked you to tell me which one of these dogs was the winner of the 2015 Westminster Kennel Club Dog Show, Would you be able to do it? Well, if you guessed this guy right here, girl actually, you'd be correct. Now, this is a German Shepherd, a very common dog breed, but also one that suffers pretty severe consequences from being inbred. In particular, German Shepherds are prone to a genetic condition called hip dysplasia. Essentially what that is when the femur doesn't fit correctly into the hip socket. And all dogs can experience some form of this condition, but it is a recessive gene, so when the breeding pool is large, we tend not to see it as frequently or as severely as we do in German Shepherds, which again have been inbred for a very long time. But here's the thing that sucks. Hip dysplasia actually gives German Shepherds this weird sloped stance, and this is a quality that breeders and showers look for in a German Shepherd so that they can make more of them with those same characteristics. And because of that, most purebred German Shepherds live very uncomfortable, if not downright painful lives. And so that kind of ties us into what we had mentioned earlier briefly about unethical practices in dog breeding. And the whole reason I brought up the Westminster Dog Show in the first place, which, by the way, I've never actually watched because it sounds super boring. But inbreeding exists because of that high demand for purebred dogs. And those dog shows help increase that demand, and then puppy mill breeders make more and more genetically uniform versions of that parent generation. And they sell that to either showers or people who watch shows or people who just want a purebred dog. And then that vicious cycle of inbreeding is perpetuated. So if you want a dog, get a mutt.
So here's a made-up example of how inbreeding could cause genetic disorders. And so what we're seeing here, what I have, is a number of individuals, okay? So each of these is supposed to represent an individual. This is just, remember, they are diploid, so they have 2 copies of every gene. All right, and these are the alleles. The alleles that most of the population have is big R, the dominant alleles. But there's just so happens to be a person born in the population that has a new genetic disorder, but the genetic disorder is recessive. So that they have a good copy of the gene and they have a mutant recessive copy. That recessive copy, what it does isn't found out till later. And in life, it turns out that when they turn 50 years old, that allele, if you have 2 bad alleles, at 50 years old, your head explodes. So on your 50th birthday, you blow out the candles, and then your head explodes. So very, very bad disorder. But it's recessive. Okay? So being recessive, does this person have the actual disorder, or are they just a carrier for the disorder? So hopefully you've realized that no, this person right here, though they have one bad, they have the recessive allele. So that is the allele that would make their head explode on their 50th birthday. Since they have that one dominant normal allele, they are actually going to be okay. So let's take a look at what would normally happen if that person right here, big R, little r, mates with anybody in the population. Well, since everybody, oh, and disregard this is just an error. So if this person mates with anybody in the population, everybody else was big R, what would happen? Since it's recessive, what are the chances that their children will have the disorder? What are the chances they will be carriers? Complete the Punnett square to find that out. And then I would like you to write the various genotypes down. hopefully this is what you came up with. And so the genotypes possible are big R, and big R, little r. Okay, 50% chance of having a child that is big R, or normal. 50% chance of the child being a carrier or having one of the bad alleles. But you'll notice that nobody actually has the disorder in the group. So nobody actually has come down yet with this horrible head exploding disorder. But what would happen if these siblings actually breed? So this is an example of inbreeding. We're going to actually have these two children. So let's say these two children, there are children that are born, big R, little r, there's two of them, and they are going to mate, which is ill-advised and a little gross. Okay, so go ahead and do the cross. Okay, big R, little r with big R, little r. We're going to do a Punnett square to see if anything happens because of this. Okay, and as you're doing this, realize that, remember, you have to be homozygous recessive to have this disorder, because it will be only seen, since it's a recessive disorder, it will only be seen in its homozygous form. And hopefully what you've seen here as you do the Punnett square is that where if people would have just not bred within the family, it would have been okay because everybody else in the population was big R. But because of the fact that they were breeding within the family, you have the rare but possible outcome that now there is this disorder that has sprung up in the population. Little r, and so this bro would have his head exploding at 50.
And hopefully this guy was experiencing his 50th birthday as a single man without any children, so that he did not pass this horrible, rare disease to any kids. All right, that is all for today's notes. I'm Mr. McGregor.
And Mr. S.
See you later.